6 brass keys hung on a single ring under Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor's desk, and by the time William's car reached the outer road, one of those locks was already being tested from the inside. The chain across the cottage gate was new. Not old iron, not decoration, just a fresh steel chain looped twice through the bars and padlocked shut. Somewhere behind the hedge, a dog barked once and stopped. William's driver slowed without being told. Grant Whitlow, the Crown Estate registrar, riding beside him, checked his watch and wrote the exact time in a small notebook. Before either man said a word, inside the house an aide was already running. He crossed the wet lawn holding a folder of 6 sublease agreements, a pen still uncapped in his other hand, changing dates that were never meant to survive daylight. Grass clippings stuck to his shoes. His breath came out in short, white clouds in the cold morning air. Andrew's instructions had been simple, repeated twice through a half-open study door. Keep the gate held, keep the ledger moving, keep the rent quiet until the folder matched whatever story the family would need to tell by lunchtime. Honestly, that is where this story really begins. Not with a newspaper report about a man who lived rent-free on royal land while quietly subletting the cottages around him. That report only lit the fuse. The fire had been building for years, ever since a grandmother's mercy turned, without her knowing it, into a nephew's income. Weeks earlier, on the morning the report first landed, Andrew had read it, standing in his study, with the curtains still closed, a cup of coffee going cold on the windowsill beside him. He had not panicked. He had simply picked up the internal phone and told his bookkeeper, in a flat, practiced voice, to move what staff had already started calling, quietly and without much affection, the greenhouse account, because the ledger for it lived behind a false page in a gardening file nobody outside the estate office ever opened. That single instruction, given before breakfast, is the real beginning of everything that follows. Now look at what William actually found when he stepped out of the car weeks later. On the morning the gate was chained, a locked gate, a folder full of changed dates, a man inside who believed that family protection could survive a Crown Estate inspection the same way it had survived everything else. Andrew was wrong, and by the end of this day, 6 brass keys would prove it. 6 keys, no exceptions. Hold on to that phrase because it comes back twice more before this is over. Here is the thing about Royal Lodge. It was never simply a house. It was a promise made by Elizabeth to a son she still loved after disgrace, on the condition that the house would keep him sheltered and quiet, not fund him. 75 years, the lease read, the longest protection the family had ever extended to a single member. She signed it so he would have somewhere to live without asking the country for another favor. She did not sign it so he could become a landlord to 6 families on the very land she gave him for shelter. William remembered that condition because he had heard his grandmother say it once, quietly at Windsor, in a private sitting room with the curtains half drawn and a fire burning low in the grate. A photograph of Andrew as a boy sat framed on the side table, and Elizabeth's hand rested near it without quite touching the glass. The house keeps him, she said, turning a signet ring once around her finger as she spoke. It does not make him money. William held on to that sentence longer than anyone in that room realized, because a grandson does not forget the exact shape of his grandmother's mercy, especially when he watches someone spend it without asking and without shame. Diana never lived to see any of this, but the instinct behind it was hers before it was William's. She believed the people who served this family quietly deserved more protection than the family members who traded on its name, and she said so more than once, in rooms that were never meant to repeat it. William grew up hearing that belief argued over, not agreed with, and it settled into him slowly, the way a family conviction does when nobody forces it. By the time he stood at that gate, it no longer felt like his grandmother's rule or his mother's instinct. It simply felt like his own. The keeper in this story is William, and what he holds is simple. The rules that say royal protection cannot become royal profit. He has the disclosure register, the head lease, the forfeiture clause, and the patience to use all 3 properly instead of loudly. The taker is Andrew, and what he wants is equally simple. Quiet income from cottages nobody was watching for as long as nobody looked. Both men had already made their first move before William's car ever reached that gate. In his private office at Windsor, William had spent 3 evenings cross-referencing the subletting disclosure register against 6 cottage addresses he had circled in red ink, a cold cup of tea forgotten at his elbow each night. Every address matched a tenant. Not one matched a filed disclosure. In the drawing room at Royal Lodge, Andrew had spent those same evenings on the phone with his solicitor, Julian Ashworth, telling him to route that month's rent through a company name instead of his own, because a name on a bank statement is so much harder to defend than a name nobody recognizes. A gate chain is not a legal argument, William told Whitlow on the drive over. Ashworth had told Andrew almost the opposite 2 nights earlier. A chain buys you a week, he said, and a week is enough time to make a folder look old. Neither man was entirely right, only one of them was about to find that out in public. In one of the cottages behind that chained gate, a woman named Marion Cole sat at her kitchen table with a folded rent receipt she had been told twice to throw away. She had heard the estate car on the gravel before she saw it. She heard the gate rattle, heard Andrew's voice somewhere near the front of the house, sharp and fast in a way it never was when he collected her rent in person, cash only, always on a Friday, always with a joke about the weather that no longer felt funny. She looked at the receipt in her hand, the ordinary paper proof of a payment that was never supposed to exist on record, and instead of feeding it into the small stove behind her, she folded it once more and pressed it flat inside her coat pocket. The kettle clicked off behind her, unheard. Steam curled against the cold window glass and faded. She was done being quiet for a landlord who was not supposed to be one. That is the human center of this story, and it matters because everything that happens next only works because one tenant chose honesty over convenience. In a kitchen nobody was filming before a single camera arrived. William's first real move came 2 days later, and it was not dramatic. It was a letter. Whitlow filed a formal inspection request under the head lease's disclosure clause, naming all 6 cottages and giving Andrew 72 hours to produce a complete account of the rent collected from each one. No accusation, no headline, just a clock, starting, delivered by hand to a footman who signed for it without reading it. Andrew read the letter standing up in the drawing room. He read the second page sitting down. He called Ashworth before he finished it. His voice pitched low enough that the housekeeper in the next room only caught fragments. Fix it. Today. Before anyone else sees the account. His countermove arrived within a day, and it was exactly the kind of move a man makes when he has confused family loyalty with legal cover. He ordered the gate chained. He told staff the inspection notice had never arrived, which was a lie 2 members of his own household had already watched him receive. He produced an old deed from a locked drawer, backdated with a date nobody could verify, its edges deliberately softened with a damp cloth to look older than it was, and told anyone who asked that it proved a private family arrangement older than any Crown estate rule. Ashworth, meanwhile, called each of the 6 tenants personally, reminding them in the gentlest, threatening voice a solicitor can manage that their cottages existed because Andrew allowed it. Marion Cole took that call standing in her own kitchen, said nothing at all, and let Ashworth mistake her silence for agreement. It was not agreement. It was the last quiet moment before she decided exactly what she would do with the receipt in her coat pocket. What most coverage missed when this story eventually broke is that Andrew's counter-move never touched the actual evidence. He locked a gate, he waived a deed, he threatened tenants who had already stopped being afraid of him. None of that erased a single line in a disclosure register that had been sitting untouched inside the Crown Estate's own filing system since before he ever changed a date. Word of the chained gate moved through the other 5 cottages faster than Andrew expected. None of the remaining tenants called Ashworth back. 2 left their curtains drawn all day, waiting to see which way the story would break before deciding whose side their silence would protect. A third, an elderly groundsman's widow, told her daughter on the phone that she had always wondered why her rent receipts never quite matched what she thought she had paid. She did not act on it, not yet, but the doubt itself was new, and doubt, once it starts moving through 6 cottages on the same afternoon, rarely moves backward. Princess Anne heard about the chained gate before William did, from a groundskeeper who still reported to her out of old habit. She did not call Andrew. She called Whitlow directly. At his desk, inside the small property office, the staff privately called the key room because it was where every spare lock and lease on the estate had been logged for 3 generations. Families protect people, she told him. Rules protect everyone else. Do the second job properly, and let the first job take care of itself. Whitlow wrote that down too in the same small notebook, under the time he had already recorded at the gate, and here is where it changes. Whitlow, working through the estate's own bound ledgers rather than the folder Andrew had handed him, found a second rent account. Not the one Andrew had already half admitted to. A different one, still active, still receiving payments, routed through the exact same company name Ashworth had suggested days earlier, hidden behind the same false gardening page the bookkeeper had used from the very first morning. It had never been cancelled. It had simply kept running underneath every denial Andrew made since the newspaper report first appeared, one payment landing as recently as the week before William's letter arrived. That second account changed everything, because it proved this was never a single lapse in judgment. It was an ongoing operation, quietly maintained through a scandal that was supposed to have ended it. William did not confront Andrew directly with what Whitlow had found. He took it to the Crown Estate Board instead, where 5 trustees sat around a long table on a wet Tuesday afternoon and heard Whitlow read the second ledger aloud, line by line, without commentary. The motion to authorize inspection and, if warranted, forfeiture passed in 9 minutes, recorded as item 4 on a minute sheet. Nobody outside that room would ever see. That is the moment the war stopped being personal and became procedural, which, if you know anything about how the Crown actually punishes its own, is always the more dangerous kind. Protection was never a business license, no matter how long Andrew had been allowed to treat it like one. Hold on to that line, because it becomes the whole point of what happens next. In private, in the hour after the board's letter reached him, Andrew was not composed. He stood at the drawing room window with the backdated deed still in his hand, and for the first time since the newspaper report, he was afraid not of exposure, but of the specific, procedural, unglamorous machinery now moving against him, a machinery that did not care about apologies. He telephoned Ashworth twice in 20 minutes. Both calls went to voicemail. He did not leave a message either time. He stood there long enough that the coffee on the windowsill, untouched since morning, had gone cold for the second time that week. 3 days later, William returned to Royal Lodge with Whitlow, a locksmith crew, and the signed forfeiture order the board had approved that morning. Andrew met them at the gate himself, the old backdated deed already in his hand, waving it toward the cameras a neighbor had tipped off without anyone's permission. A photographer crouched by the hedge, lens already up, and caught the whole thing from the first raised voice. "You cannot do this," Andrew said, loud enough for the gravel to carry it. "This house was given to me for life. My mother signed it herself." William did not raise his voice. He read the forfeiture order aloud instead, slowly, the way a man reads something he intends to be quoted correctly. Undisclosed subletting income, activating clause 14 of the head lease, immediate suspension of residential protection, immediate recovery of every key issued under this lease. That is when Marion Cole crossed the gravel. She did not shout. She walked in her coat, past 2 locksmiths already unpacking their tools, and threw her folded receipt onto the bonnet of Andrew's car. It landed flat, face up, the ink still legible enough for the photographer by the hedge to zoom in on without moving. It matched, line for line, the second account Whitlow had found, buried in the estate's own ledgers, a private payment, on paper, from a tenant Andrew had assumed would stay silent forever. Andrew looked down at the receipt on his own car and, for the first time that morning, said nothing at all. The locksmiths started on the first lock while he was still holding the deed. Brass fell away from wood, one clean piece at a time, and dropped into a canvas bag Whitlow held open at his side. 6 keys, no exceptions, Whitlow said quietly, almost to himself, and it was such a plain sentence that nobody in the courtyard thought to write it down until it was already a fact instead of a threat. Andrew was still talking about his mother's promise when the 3rd lock came away. He was still talking when the 4th one did. By the 5th, he had stopped talking altogether and simply watched, the deed hanging loose at his side as if the paper itself had gone quiet with him. Somewhere behind the photographer, a second reporter was already reading the receipt's numbers aloud into a phone, word for word, because a source inside the estate office had confirmed within the hour that the figures matched. A groundskeeper who had worked the property for 11 years stood at the tree line and watched in silence, his cap in his hands, the way people stand at something they know they will be asked about for months. That is the shareable moment of this whole story, the image people will screenshot without needing a caption. A man who once lived rent-free on a house built for his shelter, standing in his own courtyard, watching a stranger's receipt outrun every deed he owned, while brass keys dropped one by one into a bag that did not belong to him anymore. The price landed fast after that because the Crown Estate had clearly been ready to move the moment the board signed. The frozen rent account closed on a screen inside the estate office that same afternoon, Whitlow initialing the order himself at 2:04, a time he later wrote into the file without being asked. All 6 brass keys, along with Andrew's own gate key, went into the canvas bag and then into a custody cabinet inside the Crown Estate's offices, logged and photographed before the day was finished. Each key given its own serial tag and its own line in a register the staff called, without much affection, the key ledger. His name came off the Windsor Residential Access Register before dinner, a single administrative line that ended 20 years of quiet, protected access in less time than it takes to read this sentence aloud. Charles was told by phone while the locks were still being changed. He did not call William to argue. He did not call Andrew to console him. He let the process run to its full, procedural, unglamorous end, and that silence said more about where the family's patience had gone than any statement could have. By nightfall, the dinner invitation Andrew had already accepted for the following week had quietly disappeared from the guest office's list, with no explanation offered and none requested. Inside the main house, a junior courtier who had worked 3 different royal offices in 12 years told a colleague, off the record and half joking, that she had never seen a forfeiture order move that fast and that she hoped she never would again because it meant someone had been allowed to get away with something for far too long before anyone finally checked. Nobody corrected her. By evening, Andrew stood outside a gate he no longer had a key to, no rent account, no residential authority, and a small brass nameplate that had been unscrewed from the gate post and left, face down, in the gravel beside him. He did not knock. He did not call anyone official. There was, by that point, nobody left inside the process who could still open that gate for him. 6 keys came back. Andrew did not. That is the whole verdict in 5 words, and it is the only one this story needs. No lawyer softened it. No relative absorbed it. No later statement quietly reframed it as a kindness. It landed exactly once, on exactly one man, and stayed there. William took no public satisfaction in it. He signed the final custody log that same evening, without ceremony, in an office already emptying for the night because, for him, this was never about punishing a relative. It was about proving that a rule written for everyone actually applies to everyone, even a man who spent decades believing his name would always be the exception. A gate that opens for scandal can still close on it, and this particular gate closed with 6 brass keys hanging in a neat row inside a locked cabinet, Andrew's own key resting beside them like the last item on an inventory nobody wanted to argue with anymore. Elizabeth's 75-year lease was never a paycheck. It was shelter offered once on the clear understanding that it would house a disgraced son quietly instead of enriching him secretly. For years, that understanding held only because nobody looked closely enough to test it. Now it has been tested in a courtyard with a receipt on a car bonnet and 6 locks changed on camera, and the shelter finally means exactly what she intended it to mean all along. 6 keys, no exceptions, the way it should have been from the very first sublease. The custody cabinet itself is nothing dramatic to look at, just steel, waist height, bolted to the floor of a records room most staff never enter. But everyone in the property office knows exactly which shelf holds 6 brass keys and 1 gate key, arranged in the order the locksmiths removed them because Whitlow arranged them that way himself, and nobody has moved them since. It has become, without anyone deciding it should, the clearest single object on the entire estate for explaining what happens when protection is treated as a private account instead of a public trust. Marion Cole still lives in her cottage, her rent, now properly disclosed and properly logged through the same key room where Whitlow keeps his small notebook, arrives on time, on paper, with nothing hidden behind a gardening file. She was never thanked publicly, and she never asked to be. She simply stopped being quiet once in a kitchen, and the Duke lost 6 keys because of it. William still drives past that cottage row sometimes, and he has never once stopped to look at the gate. He does not need to. He knows exactly what is behind it now and exactly what is not. And for a man who spent years watching his family's patients get mistaken for permission, that quiet certainty is worth more to him than any headline this story ever produced. So here is the question worth sitting with. If a family's protection had quietly paid your rent for years and nobody was checking, would you have stopped at one hidden sublease? Or would you have signed the second one anyway, the way Andrew did, certain that a locked gate would always be enough to keep the truth outside?